One of the reasons I was convinced to offer this teaching to you is not only because the training team asked me to, but because a person I respect very, very much quoted me in a sermon, and I wept a little bit yesterday watching this video. Hopefully I won't today, but go ahead, Corey. This is part of the reason I believe that I'm supposed to speak on this, and we are recording it, Tracy, so for all those people sleeping in, we can make them watch it later.
Have you ever been working on a project and discovered that you didn't have the tool you needed? Maybe somebody had borrowed it and not returned it, or maybe you didn't even know that that tool existed. In 2005, I was a part of a work team from our church in upstate New York who traveled to Arcadia, Florida to help the folks in that city following a series of hurricanes. And I was on a team that was putting sheetrock up in a house that had experienced severe damage. Now, my gifts and training are not in the area of construction, but I just loved when the contractors in my church would invite me to go on these projects, and occasionally when they would entrust me with power tools. So on this day, I was working with my friend Russ, who was a Finnish carpenter and a cabinet maker. And we were putting up sheetrock, and I was struggling to get the screws driven in at exactly the right depth. Sometimes they were too deep, and therefore they weren't really holding much of the sheetrock. And when I would try and compensate for that, sometimes I would leave them just sticking out, which would really irritate the guys who would come and do the taping. But I noticed that every one of Russ's screws was set at the right level, just a little bit in from the surface of the sheetrock. And so I said, Russ, teach me how you do that. That's amazing. And that's when I learned about a little tool called a drywall screw setter that Russ had on the end of his drill. What an ingenious little device. It sets the screws at the right depth every time. I didn't even know that such a tool existed. But when I got back from that trip, I went right out, I bought a couple of them, and I've been looking for sheetrock to hang ever since. 5 years ago, I discovered that I was missing a tool in my spiritual toolbox. Like the drywall screw setter, I didn't even know this tool existed. And I had been compensating throughout my many years of being a Christian without it. 5 years ago in our congregation, we had a tragic death. It was the most difficult death that I had dealt with as a pastor in almost 30 years of ministry. The next day, one of my friends, Matt, who also was a pastor, called me up to encourage me and support me. And he said, "Are you familiar with Psalm 13? Now, I know I had read Psalm 13 probably several times, but I couldn't remember what it said. So Matt said, let's read it together, and we read it together over the phone. And then he said, Psalm 13 is going to become your friend this week. And it did. Every day when I met with that grieving family, when I didn't have words for that situation, we just prayed Psalm 13. That week, I discovered that the tool that was missing from my spiritual toolbox were the Psalms of Lament. This morning, I'm excited to introduce you to those Psalms if you're not familiar with them. And I'm going to introduce you to them in the same way that I was introduced to them, with the words of Psalm 13. So if you have your Psalm scriptural journal or your Bible, if you would turn to Psalm 13. Listen carefully as I read to us God's word. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Lift up your eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Would you pray with me?
I take notes. I did print off a basic outline. Thanks, Stefan. Thanks, Bob. When the iPad had been invented, but people didn't know about it, Steve Jobs was in Central America talking with people about it, and the man he was with said, how are people going to know how to use this, especially people that are not tech savvy? Jobs handed the iPad to a 5-year-old who didn't have electricity or running water, had never seen a computer. The 5-year-old hit the home button and slid the iPad and turned it on and started playing games. Because it's built for an intuitive person to touch it until they figure it out. My 2-year-old has locked mine several times for me. I believe the Psalms are similar. If we don't let some of the things that so often get in the way, we know that the Psalms will lead us through doing and experiencing every emotion of life, but with God. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, but that was a sermon, and this is a little bit more of a teaching time. How does your church preach the Psalms? How do you encourage your people to integrate them into their lives? Do you encourage people to learn to pray them? Do you pray them? All of them? Do you encourage your people to become psalm writers? I believe that's one of the most profound opportunities for us, is not only to learn the Psalms and to let them pray us, but then to learn to write our own. In the same way that Jesus didn't say pray these words, he said pray like this. The Psalms were his prayer book. My concern is that if we treat the Psalms as an academic work, when they are academic but they are not first academic, our people will not know how to use them, especially in the times that Steve was talking about. And if you know what tragedy he was talking about, you wept a little bit like I did. And if you don't, that's okay. We talked about this yesterday, but C.S. Lewis says that there are 3 kinds of language, and it's interesting that I'm quoting him because I think he gets the Psalms a little bit wrong. Yep, I said it. Poetry is important, especially when we're full of joy, when we're oriented, when we know who God is and who we are and what our purpose is. But poetry is perhaps more important if we factor in the number of Psalms of Lament. It's the highest. Poetry is even more important when we are disoriented. And then poetry is perhaps even more important when we're disoriented and then reoriented, because that's the gospel. He took us out of the miry clay and set our feet upon a rock, making our footsteps firm. I'm a huge fan of Marilyn Robinson, the author. I also believe that all of you need good fiction in your life. That's not what we're talking about today. But in the novels Gilead and Home, that center on 2 different pastors in a small town, there are some outlier characters. And somehow they didn't learn the poetry that they needed. Lila and Jack are who I'm talking about. Novels are beautiful. She won the Pulitzer. But they needed not just the scientific language of theology, not just the mundane language of how do we do this life before God, but also poetry that helps us live through our seasons of orientation and disorientation and reorientation. When I was 21 years old, I was in my second semester of Hebrew at the University of Missouri with 3 grad students and 3 Jews because I didn't know that the Lord was calling me into ministry. I just wanted to understand the Bible better. I was also in a Psalms and Wisdom Literature class taught by a Presbyterian professor down from Westminster College in Fulton, which is where Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech. And the professor knew that I was a nerd for the Bible, taking Hebrew just for elective credit. It's fun. I really thought I was going to teach like English and film and coach basketball. And the way the professor taught was he would give us these tools, and then he would ask us to present back to the class. So he had 2 weeks of very intense lectures, and then we took the tools from his lectures and led discussion. And this guy knew that I was serious, and so he gave me this. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we encountered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our lyres, for our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem, how they said, lay it bare, down to its foundation. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to be destroyed, blessed shall be he who repays you with what you have done to us." If you're a pastor and your people read their Bibles, some of them have come to your office and said, "What's the deal with blessed shall be he who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock?" I'm 21 years old. I'm sitting in a Subway sandwich station. I have books everywhere. Hebrew, the English Tanakh, NRSV, NIV, a few books on the Psalms, and I just push back from the table. What is happening here? And this particular psalm we know the historical context of, but if we start there, we miss the beautiful opportunity. I read this line from Brueggemann, and I switched. I was no longer going to teach and coach. I'm going to do ministry. I'm not sure what kind, but if this is the depth of relationship God calls us into, especially perhaps in our most disoriented moments, then I'm in. And what he said was, I said it yesterday, but I'm going to say it again because it's a good quote, and I memorized it immediately. That doesn't happen very often, for me anyway. It is an act of profound faith to entrust one's most precious hatreds to God, knowing they will be taken seriously. The reason this is titled "Give Your People Back the Psalms" is the way I was taught to teach the Psalms in seminary was categories like these, right? There are royal psalms, there are psalms of lament, testimonial or praise, pilgrim, imprecatory. Be honest with me. How many of your people know the word imprecatory in a way that matters? But that's how Psalm 74 and 79 and 137 are described, missing the human side of it. And that doesn't mean that we don't need this category. But I believe it means we do not need this category first. Giving our people back the Psalms means letting them experience the disorientation within them and realizing that that is a tool when we are in our own seasons of orientation. All of you have sat with a hurting friend, and at some point they shared something with you and you knew what an honor it was, and you knew not to fix, you knew not to ask a leading question, and you said something along the lines of, "Wow, that sounds disorienting." And then you did something profoundly human. You sat on the mourner's bench together like someone who loves God and loves the person sitting next to you. When we first teach our people all of those categories. By the way, everybody disagrees on which ones are most essential, because sometimes we know the context of the psalm, sometimes we don't, either from the co-text or from the heading. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we know what happened in the story, and sometimes we don't. When we begin with those, we take the Psalms away from our people. And in my opinion, we actually misrepresent the Psalms with respect to their utility. That's the end of Psalm 88. You have felt that way. Many of your people have felt that way for acute reasons and for chronic reasons. And if you teach them this is an individual or communal lament, you might distract them from the fact that it's useful to be honest with God about how dark our experience of the world can be. The gospel is in the Psalms, and it's so beautifully in the Psalms. The steadfast love of the Lord. I love when our people that wish for hymns say they shouldn't be repetitive for two reasons. One, many hymns are repetitive. Two, I just always think of Psalm 136. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. But the Psalms, when they get to the problem of evil, they don't nuance it. They don't explain it. They do what is so human to do that if we give our people back the Psalms, they will then become more and more skilled in and thereby more comforted by God. They drop the problem of evil right at the foot of God, expecting him to show up and do something and say something. And we desperately need revelation to tell us how it's going to end. And we need Jesus' promises and comfort, his predictions of the destruction of Jerusalem and of his return. But in the moment, we need to know how to say, how long? Where are you? I can't sleep because I'm drenching my bed with tears. One of the lovely gifts also of the Psalms, and this is an odd challenge, is to teach us to praise when we're actually in a season of orientation. When things have been going well as we would esteem them, for many of us, that's when we forget to pray, but the Psalms would continue to lead us and say, you're in a lovely season of orientation. Remember to praise God for it. He is indeed making you like a tree by living water. He is indeed leading you away from being like chaff that blows away. Psalm 1. Got a B- on my Psalm 1 exegetical paper because I just wanted to write about it. I didn't want to do all the Hebrew footnotes. And I was right. Psalm 24 teaches us to look at the sky and know that it proclaims the Lord's handiwork. Psalm 63:3 reminds us that the steadfast love of the Lord is better than life. The Psalms can teach us to practice life in all of its seasons. And especially the seasons that are sweet after the seasons of the worst disorientation. I think David was physically ill and was healed in Psalm 30. And he says, as for me, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favor, O Lord, you made my mountain stand strong. You hid your face. I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I cry, and to the Lord I plead for mercy. What profit is there in my death if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? I said it before, I'm going to say it again. I may never be invited to training team again, that's fine. There is an intimacy in being willing to be negative and sarcastic because it's an honest representation of how we feel. Then I believe he was healed. You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have loosed my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, that my glory may sing your praise and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. In addition to, however, you are already utilizing and teaching the Psalms, I hope that you will teach your people orientation and disorientation and reorientation. It starts to sound like not a word after we say it too many times. But people grab it because they know that that's life. They know those are the seasons of life, and that God's truth abides in the seasons of life. And we want to learn to answer him in light of that, to quote Eugene Peterson's lovely little book on the Psalms. The Psalms teach us to answer God about what it's actually like in light of his truth. In that we let the Psalms pray us. If this is a new practice for you, a little bit like Steve was alluding to, just read the Psalm of that day. But if you want to use the old monkish practice of adding 30 and 30 and 30, so that'd be Psalm 29 today, and Psalm 59, Psalm 89, you'll end up experiencing every emotion, broadly speaking, available to a human. Every one. That's part of the beauty and benefit of reading 5 of them a day. I mostly read 1 or 2 now because I read them slower, and I'm still letting them read me and inform my own prayer. Tracy was alluding to, and I alluded to yesterday, some hard things in my life. This is the waiting room where I would take my wife for her chemotherapy. And when I would go, I would bring a copy of the Psalms and I would leave it. Most of the time. One time I was buying the expensive ones and I'm like, I can't buy the expensive ones. And then the paperbacks hadn't come in yet, so I didn't bring the Psalms with me. And the reason is a person in that room can pick up the Psalms and experience rage, sadness, questioning of God. What does his steadfast love actually feel like in a world where we poison people to make them well? You know, that's what chemo is. Anybody ever read Chris Hitchens' lovely article about it? He says, I really resonate with this. If you don't, that's fine. But I've also had cancer and chemotherapy, so let me have my own, I have the microphone. He said it's the least like a battle of anything I've ever experienced. You lay there and you read or you don't read while the poison sac does its work or doesn't. I resonate with that very much. And yet I also want to pray. And if I only know one of those acronym prayers, I'm not being honest with God. If I only know the Lord's Prayer, which I've been preaching on the Lord's Prayer for 5 months, that's how fond of it I am. But if I don't know how to say darkness is my closest friend, how long? Where are you, God? How could you let this happen? You're a covenanting God, and I remember those covenants, and I know you do too. There's a lot of bargaining language in the Psalms. I am lonely and afflicted, Psalm 26. I am a worm and not a man, Psalm 22. Shame has covered my face, Psalm 44. My iniquities have overtaken me and I cannot see, Psalm 40. How many of you remember when we used to sing just the first two verses of Psalm 42, as the deer pants for the water? I love it. But now I go back and I look at that psalm, and it's a psalm of lament. It just starts all sweet, but we don't sing the non-sweet parts. But we need the non-sweet parts and the sweet parts. The non-sweet parts make the sweet parts sweeter. That's not in my notes. How did it go? It's a good line. I want to encourage you to give your people back the Psalms. At the beginning of COVID, I read an article by David Kessler, who has continued on the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in Stages of Grief. Article's about 5 pages long. It was very good, and the title of it was "The Discomfort You Feel is Grief." Big collective grief, in addition to all our acute and circumstantial and chronic griefs, was the communal grief of COVID. And then I bought his book on the 6th stage of grief, meaning, and I couldn't read it. Not in 2020. To read on meaning, 2020 would have been inappropriate. So I asked the Lord to teach me about grief. And I went to the Psalms, and I found that most of them cover all 5 stages. And it's my highlighter. I took that picture about 20 minutes ago. If you're like, that's a terrible resolution, welcome to my tech team and my disagreements. Not disagreements. They get to abide with me. This is from Psalm 56. "In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me?" It's denial because of the disorientation. And for a Christian, denial is both a good move and a potentially dangerous move. We can always praise, but we want to be honest. All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. That's anger. They stir up strife. They lurk. They watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crime will they escape? I know no one in your churches ever stirs up strife, but sometimes people in my church do. How do I talk to God about that? It's right there. Anger. In wrath, cast down the peoples, O God. Orange for me is bargaining, step 3, because an acknowledgement of the covenants that God has made with us and expecting him to show up is expecting him to make good on his covenants. Not because he's not sovereign, but because as human beings, we don't experience, we can't see his work most of the time. We believe in it and we trust it, and the way that we trust it is to express to him when it's harder to trust it than when it's easier. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Depression. And I didn't take a picture because I was running out of time and my iPad wasn't charged up and I wasn't positive these pictures were going to show up. But the last verse of Psalm 56 is acceptance of God's reign. And it says, "For you have delivered my soul from death. Yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life." We all need to learn to accept this grief and to grieve as those with hope. To invert Paul's command to the Thessalonians, we don't grieve as those without, so we grieve with hope. And the Psalms can and will teach us how to do it, especially if we don't begin with an academic classification of them, but begin with a human classification of them. We still keep the academic, we still pay attention when it's royal and messianic and all that, but begin with, I want to let these pray me. To have this full experience of the with God life before God, fully honest, fully able to joyfully praise, fully able to question him. My encouragement to you, ruling elders, teaching elders, guests, missionaries, friends, is to give your people back the Psalms in the way they were written and given to us. Let's pray. God, you are indeed our shepherd. Your Holy Spirit is indeed giving us a stability of soul like that of a tree. Goodness and mercy will follow us. Your steadfast love never ceases, and we praise you for it. By your grace, Lord, let us be gripped by the intimacy you invite us into through the many writers thousands of years ago who penned and sang individually and sang corporately these challenging but beautiful songs and psalms. Amen. And it's not 10 o'clock. Well, that was you that was giving me a hard time.
Both, because you turn me back on.
Matt's going to take a couple questions if you have any.
Did you find it, Corey? You did. Way to go. Corey's a tech genius, but he's not usually on the soundboard. Any questions? They can be personal, anecdotal. Dean? That's a great question. When I pray Psalm 29 today, if it rages, I sit with that for a second, because there's probably some anger in me. If it's depressed, I sit with that for a second, because I have some reasons to be sad. As one of my mentors, Zach Eswine, wrote, it's wise to be sad about sad things. I actually meant to cover this, and I even had a slide on it, but I think I forgot to send it to you guys. There are a couple ways to do this congregationally. Using the Psalms for calls to worship. We experienced that yesterday. I periodically would do a series called Open to the Middle, because Christians do this thing where they just open the Bible and start reading it, and most trained people are like, not the best way to read the Bible. What I would say, it's not evil, but what I say is when you long to have a devotional experience with God, go to the Psalms. Another way to do it is seasonally. So before you start your series on Galatians, do a psalm that perhaps would help them focus on the fall, not autumn, not the fall of man, but autumn, when the earth goes fallow. Perhaps do one, instead of a throwaway sermon, do one in between your Advent series and your series on Matthew next January, where we accept the winter season. Those are a couple of ways to preach the Psalms. A year doesn't go by that we don't cover this in my church. I really use those highlighters too. I read the Psalm slowly, and then I have the 5 highlighters out, and in my experience, 4 out of 5 Psalms cover all 5 of the stages. And for me, that makes the joy more full, to have experienced the other stages within that time. Yes, sir. I probably would now. At the time, I had nothing. You know what I mean? Yeah. Yes, ma'am. And the more familiar we are with them, the more that we would just accept, I would say write it free-flowy. A number of years ago, an 11-year-old died of an 8-year battle with brain cancer at my church. And I asked 2 of our elders if they would write laments, and they did. And they were very questioning and very sad. Never once impugning God's character, but lamenting. And I was so thankful that they were willing and able to do that. We also have lots of happy things that happened at the barn. Yes, Andrew. All of his books on the Psalms are basically around this theme, and they're good. And Brueggemann is a liberal theologian, but his goal is to talk about the text. And so the message of the Psalms, it changed my life. And 2 months before I was diagnosed with cancer in 2009, I was taking a class on Job and suffering. Yep, yes. I love a group of mature Christians that can, because that is funny. And ended up reading Hauerwas's God, Medicine, and Suffering, which quotes Brueggemann's book almost more than it has its own words, and then looks at a novel called The Blood of the Lamb about a young woman who's dying. And it's really given me it's formed my thinking on suffering. God, Medicine, and Suffering is one of the most challenging books I've ever read. I threw it across the room twice, sobbing. But that's because suffering is real, and we get to offer the grace and mercy of Jesus as we're honest about that. The scheme that he uses, he didn't make up, but he has written about the clearest. And so I think there are at least 3 or 4. They're all kind of brief, too. If you've seen his Old Testament book, it's not brief at all, but his Psalms books are pretty brief. So, Psalm 137 is on my wall in my office, and it's all stenciled, and I guarantee you no one has read it. Because if they had, they'd be like, why is this on your wall? My mother-in-law bought it for me when I became ordained, because she knows my story. Welcome, Mr. Moderator. Yes, sir.
So, speak a little bit, if you would, about the importance of spiritual beings, like we're suffering, about the importance of
No to the last question. I used to write poetry. I write a little bit differently. I wouldn't call it poetry, but I do write about these things. I went to 2 poetry readings in the last few years, and if you had told me 10 years ago that I'd be going to poetry readings, I'd be, why? And yet, this is going to sound a little crass, but it's some of the best live entertainment available because the story is there. A poet in our congregation likes the form of found poetry. So taking a word or a phrase from a child, in this case, and his son, when he was 5, looked up at him and said, "Dad, what does God look like?" And he said, "I had a nice moment as a parent, and I knelt down and said, 'What do you think he looks like, buddy?' And he said, 'He looks like everybody.'" And I was like, oh. I know his son, and I know him. And so I'm reading more poetry than I used to. Ada Limon, Naomi Shihab Nye, but mostly it's to go to the Psalms with my highlighters and and then sit with each emotion or stage. I do write about this, but I wouldn't call it poetry. Yes, sir. Chris.
As I work with children and youth, how have you introduced lament to your kids?
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, you and your wife have had lament. Do you just lament in your bedroom and then come out with happy faces and lollipops, or what's that?
No. My 17-year-old, we were walking down the stairs together, and she goes, Dad, what is the deal with Psalm 68? And I was like, that's fun. And I have to be very, very careful as a pastor, like to answer slowly, and what do you see? And ask as many non-leading questions as I can, but we just opened it up and looked at it together. I'll answer a question that's adjacent to yours. We started a Christian school in the 70s, and it's a mile from here. And one of our members teaches 5th grade, and that includes Bible. And he does a course, and it ends with the children writing their own psalms, including psalms of lament. And that's as happy as I've been as a pastor to know that a local teacher was teaching his kids to write the psalms. For my older daughter, it's a very careful conversation of asking a lot of questions. For my middle daughter, it's a more direct conversation. And for my son, it's just whether he's watching Cars or not, because he's 2. You should not only be laughing because of Cars, but also because I have a 17-year-old and a 2-year-old. Dean, I don't think I'm usually that squirmy. I don't think I directly answered either of your questions. Yes, Beth. Absolutely. Beth is a ruling elder here and was in charge of my search committee, so that either makes her smart or not smart, depending on your view.
So I guess I wanted to comment on what it's like to be a congregant with these 10 years with Matt. So we have those moments like you did at worship yesterday when he goes, I need 6 barn people to come up here because he realized he's doing communion, hasn't told anybody. And then he goes, okay, you've been working with me for 10 years. You know how this goes. Just get up here. So the upshot of that and how it relates to the Psalms, I think, is the continuous teaching of the Psalms for us as a congregation. I do this as a straw poll all the time. You didn't know that, so now you know. So isn't it easier to be human and be a believer over these last 10 years? And we all agree that we've learned a lot more about what it's like to be human, because I know we all struggle with that. You know, Christian, we may have all the emotions, but we're only really supposed to express the band in the middle and the occasional highs. It really has made it easier to deal with all the feelings for ourselves and for the people that we work with, and then know that if we're in a struggle with a particular kind of emotion, we've been going through the Psalms, and if you go to Matt, you're going like, I'm stuck right there, you know that someone can talk to you about that. So when Matt did the mourner's bench, because one of our kids had died, that was really interesting, because that was the time I think we really learned as a church that we had not equipped ourselves for serious grief. Really hadn't equipped ourselves for serious grief. Now, some people couldn't cope with it. That was totally understandable. We didn't go on forever, because it was only a few weeks. But even doing, like, writing the Psalms, actually, our own Psalms, actually brought resolution to some of that. I wrote one of the laments. One of the outcomes of that for me that was interesting was that we have a really strong older group in our church called Gray Power, and they asked for multiple copies because they'd lived a long life and they had wanted to know how to deal with their own grief. And so they used it there. So it helped at all different levels. So I just want to say it's easier to be human if you teach the Psalms.
I didn't know they all got copies of your lament, though. That encourages me. Thanks, Beth.
Matt,
Is that Glenn? Yep.
I want to explore a question
So when he's deeply moved, you know the Greek. It's used in other passages in John 11. He's deeply moved. It's used in other passages not in the Bible for like the snorting of a war horse before battle. So yeah, he wept, but he was very, very, very unhappy about death. I would say so. I wouldn't say he has hatred the way that the Israelites did for what was done to them by the Edomites and the Babylonians. But I would say he experienced anger beautifully. I just noticed a few years ago that he was careful with the birds when he flipped the tables out, because it wasn't their fault they were in cages. He's not careful with the tables, but he was careful with the birds. And we have a lot of instances. So we know about 54 days of Jesus' earthly ministry, if you stack it all up. And we have multiple incidents of anger and deep sadness and tears.